Human anger was created by God to motivate us. This is what I think. I think God allows us to experience this. Now, don't get me wrong. Satan can use this emotion, and we'll study that, Lord willing, next week. When Satan uses the emotion of anger to cause us to sin or to lead us into sin. But I wanted to set the tenor for next week's lesson by saying that this is an emotion God created to motivate us to take constructive action in the face of wrong. God created this to motivate us, to move us forward. I want to give you an example of this. David. We all know David's story. David was a man after God's own heart. Now, we also know that in 2 Samuel chapter 12, David sinned. And David committed sin not only against God, but David committed sin against others around him. He not only hurt Bathsheba, but he hurt Uriah, killed him, in fact. So, David's sin and his sinful desires led him into sin. But I want you to understand, there's an element here where God uses anger, David's own anger, in order to teach David a lesson. Now, mind you, all this sin has come about. God's anger in and of itself is kindled against David here. But Nathan the prophet comes to David. Now, I pity Nathan. This is nowhere, no one ever wants to approach somebody. You never want to walk up to somebody and say, you're living in sin. That's probably the hardest thing anyone ever has to do, is to call someone on the carpet. Nathan's job, call David on the carpet. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought, and he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie down in his arms. And it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled. Notice that. David experiences this emotion, this indignation. David, being a man after God's own heart, has righteousness. And he has love. Well, because he has righteousness and understands what is right and wrong, David sees the wrong that is done in this story. David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, you are the man. You are the man. You're the one. Now, if David had not experienced anger when Nathan is telling him this story, he would never have seen or acknowledged his own sin. And David would never have sought forgiveness. You see what anger did for David? David desired righteousness, and David desired love. Because of those elements in his life, David felt indignation or anger at the rich man who had stolen something that belonged to the poor man. And David was able to see himself when Nathan says, you are the man. David is able to see himself and his own sinful acts in that story. And he is able to seek God and to seek God's forgiveness. Go back into the book of Isaiah for a moment, Isaiah 58. Let's go back here. God speaking through the prophet Isaiah to the children of Israel. Isaiah 58 and in verse 6. Isaiah says, "It is not the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and to bring the homeless poor into your house, and when you see the naked, to cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh." God says, I didn't choose the wicked. I didn't choose the fast. God's ways are not our ways. I don't think if I were God, I would ever have created the emotion of anger. But yet it works. It works so perfectly because God chose the emotion. God created it. Now, when you're angry, first thing, admit that you're angry. This is the hardest thing in the world to do. You know, something will happen. Hey, will look over at me. Are you upset with me? No. No, I'm not upset with you at all. In the case, like, What'd I do? The first thing we have to do is admit to ourselves. Because, you know, it's not that I'm afraid to admit to Kate that I'm angry. I don't want to admit to myself that I'm angry. The first thing we have to do when we are angry, when we're experiencing the emotion, is to admit that we're angry. And then we need to push pause for just a moment. And that's difficult too sometimes. But ask yourself, is this emotion positive or negative? Anger, the emotion, can be both positive and negative. Today we're going to talk about the positive. Lord willing, next week we'll talk about the negative. The positive emotion to anger, if I'm analyzing and trying to figure it out, I have to ask myself, is my response to this situation that has caused me to feel the emotion of anger, is my response to this situation rooted in love and holiness or righteousness? Is my response that has caused this emotion rooted in love and holiness? If anger is to be productive, again, stop, don't let it boil over. You know, I grew up at home. We had a wood stove. Mom had a wood cook stove. I had a gas burner. Dad had put a gas burner in this wood cook stove. That stove was on all the time. The cast iron would heat up. And I remember Mom, particularly with rice or pasta, you know, those things tend to boil over. You know, when they begin to boil, it just boils, and pretty soon, or oatmeal is another one. It boils over very easily. So what we learned as children, Mom would teach us as we were cooking on the wood stove, to move the pan off the heat. There's always a hot spot on a wood stove. And there's always cooler spots on the wood stove. When that pot would begin to boil over, we had to learn to move it off the heat. Now we have an electric stove and you just turn the knob down. So when you stop, the first thing you need to do is to stop that boiling. Turn the heat down. Because look at what Solomon says in Proverbs. If anger is to be productive, we need to make sure that our anger or indignation is rooted in righteousness and in love. Look at Proverbs chapter 29 and in verse 11. Proverbs 29:11. Solomon says, "A fool gives vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back." In other words, it's like a boiling pot of water on the stove. The fool allows his oatmeal to boil over and scorch. The wise man moves it off the heat. Also back in Proverbs chapter 19, also in verse 11, Solomon says, "Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense." Okay, so maybe your anger is justified. You've been hurt in some way. If anger is to be productive, you have a choice to make. Maybe the right choice at the time is to overlook the offense.